Yo.
Hey, I am Brother Lawrence, Coach Lawrence. The title is interchangeable. If you're new here, do me the honor of selecting subscribe and select all notifications so you can get all of my content. I'm going to be coming out with a lot of new content. Also going to be coming out with several other parts of this series that we're covering today. And make sure you hit the thumbs up button at the base of the video. This is how the video is circulated. And if you can't do that, I want you to do me the honor of sharing this video on your social media platform and help the word get out about what we're talking about if you appreciate the content. And today we're continuing our series, Sexual Healing and Biblical Sex Education. And this is part two. Yes, part two. It took me a while to get to it. We're not going to go over part one or review it because for the sake of time. But what I'm going to do that I didn't do in the last video is put a timestamp so that if you don't want to watch the entire video, you can click on the summary and be able to watch the summary of the video. I didn't do that, but I'm going to start doing that. So I just want to get started today. And we're going to be talking about our part two of our series, Sexual Healing and Biblical Sex Education. Now, we have two main objectives, and that is, number one, we want to talk about what does the Bible say in terms of the Old Testament about sexual sins. And number two, I'm going to give a very short testimony about how my life applies to the topic that we're covering today. And I just want to talk about from the jump. This was inspired by a book that I read from one of my sisters in Christ. Very transparent. I was shocked of how honest she was. And I read the book from, front to cover, from the front cover to the back. And it just inspired me to contribute to the conversation. And so this is how I came up with this topic. Now, after today, once we know and flesh out what we're talking about, we're no longer going to have an excuse about why we can't do what the Word of God is calling us to do. And James 4:17 says, therefore, to him that knoweth to do a good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. And we know that sin is missing the mark of God. Now, point one we want to cover quickly is that the forbidden sexual behaviors that are outlined in the Old Testament, specifically those that are in Leviticus 18, right, which is the chapter where it covers the forbidden sexual practices, right? Those things are generally called fornication in the New Testament. Fornication is just a general word that applies to different types of sexual behaviors or sins, right? So let's look at the first thing that we want to cover, which is what I chose, and that is sexual assault. And we're going to be looking at Deuteronomy 22 and 25, and we're going to read that. But if a man findeth a betrothed damsel in the field, and the man force her and lie with her, then the man only that lay with her shall die. Now, the word betrothed means that she's either engaged to be married or espoused, right? Now, when we talk about sexual assault, there's two components of sexual assault generally, and that is a lack of consent and force. And so we see here by this example in Deuteronomy 22 and 25, we see both of those elements. One, a lack of consent, and two, force. And it says he forced, right? And that Hebrew word for force means to seize strongly. And in the English, we would basically call that he overpowered her, right? So there's other references of sexual assault in Deuteronomy 28, chapter 22, verses 28 and 29, that talks about compensation for sexual assault victims. But we're not going to cover that in this episode. We're going to stick with 22 and 25. And we just talked about how she was in the field, and he finds her, overpowers her, and lays with her. And the consequences of his actions, was death. Okay. Now let's look at the definition of the phrase sexual assault. Illegal sexual conduct that usually involves force upon a person without consent. We see that those two components, the lack of consent and force, or it's inflicted upon a person who is incapable of giving consent, right? For maybe a mental or physical incapacity, right? And then it also happens from a person who's usually in a position of authority or somebody you trust, all right? So let's bring a modern context to this biblical scripture and principle, right? This idea of sexual assault that is represented in Deuteronomy 22 and 25. Now, there's our stats that show that African American women generally experience higher rates of sexual trauma and sexual assault, right? For every black woman who reports rape, at least 15 black women do not report, right? So we have an issue not only with sexual assault in our community, but we have an issue with it being reported. I'm going to play a video, which is about 40 seconds long, of African American women speaking in their own words about this issue of not reporting sexual assault, particularly on HBCs, historically black college campuses. And I'll play that video right now.
It may not receive. You know, I think it's a cultural thing. For the black community, but also like the collegiate community. For black people, I think we're taught from a really young age that we shouldn't snitch. Like nobody wants to be a snitch, right? So you can't tell on anybody. And the other part is us always protecting black men. You saw that with Cosby. People didn't want to believe the victims because they said he was about to buy NBC. You can't bring a black man down. And I think when you attend an HBCU and you live and breathe and you operate in this culture of blackness, right, you want to protect your own naturally. Mm-hmm. And also we've been kind of taught that and conditioned to do that. Mm-hmm. But it is at the expense of black women.
Right. So you see that she talked about two things, about the no snitch culture, right? And then she talks about black women protecting black men. Black men protect black women as well, but I understand her point. The point that she was trying to make, that some men are successful and black women are protecting them, even when they are doing things that are wrong. Now, there is an article that says no snitching. Right? I've got the article up here. You can see it. No snitching, the Black Community Universal Code. And it says there's a long-standing rule in the black community that simply states no snitching. And that reasoning that follows is phrased as snitches get stitches, right? So that's the whole point. So the point is that a lot of these sexual assaults that are happening in our community or on college campuses are not being reported because of this universal code. And so that's not right. I don't believe that's right. And I believe that we should not protect people in our community, even if they are African American, who are predators and who are preying upon our sisters and our brothers. All right. So the third point I want to make is that the church and the black community has to come to grips and understand the truth about the rate of sexual assault that women are experiencing, black women are experiencing, and also the fact that men also experience sexual trauma. And we're going to talk about that. So those are some things that we need to come to grips with in our community and even in the church. But I don't believe that we can actually handle the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
And the truth is that 1 in 4 black girls will be sexually abused before the age of 18. 1 in 5 black women are survivors of rape. 35% of black women experience some form of contact sexual violence during their lifetime. 40 to 60% of black women report being subjected to coercive sexual conduct by age 18. 17% of black women experience sexual violence other than rape by an intimate partner during their lifetime. So we as men in our community and men in the church, we have to speak out against this type of behaviors. We cannot be sexually assaulting our sisters or anyone else in our community. It's not acceptable. And we, as the men of our community, have to speak up and speak out against this behavior, right? So if you or anyone else is looking for assistance related to sexual assault, please contact the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-HOPE. Now, ladies have been, fairly transparent about the stories in terms of trauma that they've experienced. And sometimes they tell their stories and people say, well, you're telling, you're dramatizing the drama. You're making a big deal about it. But Revelation 12:11 says that they overcame, right, by the word of their testimony. So as long as our testimony is uplifting and we're talking about how God has delivered us and we're talking about how we've overcome this thing, I think it's productive to share our stories. But a lot of times we don't really understand this point of view from men, right? Our sisters are wondering why come men can't be exclusive and why come they can't be intimate and why they can't be faithful and all these things. And I believe that at the base of some of that is sexual trauma that men have experienced. So some men could be watching this video who have experienced sexual trauma as a child or maybe even as an adult. So we We tend to hide how we feel. We tend to not talk about these things because it doesn't build our ego. It's vulnerable. It requires a level of vulnerability, right? And so many times we were the victims, and now we become the victimizers, right? Because we went through the cycle of trauma. Let's cover some stats as it talks about this, and it says, in the survey of adults, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men report that they were sexually abused as a child, right? Also, many African Americans think that the childhood sexual abuse is more typical among white people, but stats show that the blacks are sexually victimized in childhood at the same rates as whites. Now, that is an alarming stat. And the reason why is because African Americans are about 12.7% of the total population, and whites are about 61.6% of the total population, but we're experiencing sexual trauma as children at about the same rate. Now, that's an incredible stat. Now, as we transition from there, we talked about childhood sexual trauma. There are men who have experienced sexual trauma while they were incarcerated. There was an article that's titled "Exposure to Prison Sexual Assault Among Incarcerated Black Men." And what they did was they did a random survey of 134 men, and 43% of those men admitted to hearing another man be sexually assaulted. Now, that's traumatic within itself. You know what I mean? You're in prison, you're incarcerated, and you're listening to a man scream for help because he's being sexually assaulted. And 16% of these men said they actually saw the sexual assault take place. So you have men who were not only abused as children, right? And then you have men who are abused in the penal system, in the system where they was incarcerated, right? So we transition there and we go back to slavery, right? What they used to call what is buck breaking, B-U-C-K, buck breaking, right? There's an article that talks about that calls sexual trauma. Buck breaking, the use of sexual violence against enslaved men as punishment for wrongdoing. What is buck breaking? Mainly utilized by slave owners in the Caribbean, buck breaking was used against male slaves who were seen as defiant. So basically, they would, basically have them pull their pants down, right? And then they would do all types of things to them with their underwear, down, and humiliate them and do different things to them. So much so that they had like a group of these men that would go from plantation to plantation, basically publicly punishing these men, right, from plantation to plantation. And they said it was basically like gang rape. Right. So imagine that. We have our brothers who were, sexually assaulted as children, and our brothers who were sexually assaulted in prison when they were incarcerated. And then you have this curse of slavery and the sexual assault that many men or many slaves, male slaves, experienced during slavery. Now, let's bring that home to me as I tell my short testimony about what happened to me at the age of 4 or 5. Now, at the age of 4 or 5, I was sexually molested by an older male relative who is no longer living, right? And I'm not gay. I'm not bisexual. This didn't happen when I was a teenager or an adolescent or an adult. This was something that happened when I was a child, right? So I would be part of the 1 in 6 of the stats, right? So these are the type of things that we don't talk about, and these things spill over into our relationships for many men, right? Let's talk about some of the residuals of childhood sexual trauma versus adult sexual trauma, right? Childhood sexual trauma is associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicide, alcohol problems, and eating disorders. Survivors may also experience low sexual interest, relationship difficulties, and engage in high-risk sexual behaviors and have extreme coping strategies, right? Let's look at adult sexual trauma. Is associated with short-term and long-term psychological consequences. Short-term effects include shock, fear, anxiety, confusion, withdrawal. Many survivors experience a reduction in the symptoms a few months, whereas some women experience distress for years. So this is something that can go on for years. Long-term outcomes include PTSD, depression, eating disorders, sexual dysfunction, alcohol and illicit drug use, non-fatal suicidal behavior, and suicide threats. Physical symptoms of the absence of medical conditions, and severe preoccupation with how they look. So these are some of the residuals, right, of childhood and sexual trauma. Now, today we're talking about part 2 of sexual healing and biblical sex education. Now, let's transition over to a Bible story that talks about sexual assault. And we're going to go over to 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 10 through 14. And we're covering the story of Tamar and her half-brother Amnon. And so just to recap the first 1 through 9 verses, what's really going on in this story is that Amnon is plotting to sleep with his sister. He's in love with her. And so he gets his buddy on board, and they're basically hatching a plot to get Tamar into his bed. Let's pick it up at 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 10. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the bedroom that I may eat from your hand." So Tamar took the cakes which she had made and brought them into the bedroom to her brother Amnon. Now she's doing what she's supposed to do, right? When she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come lie with me, my sister." Key words is my sister. And we know that this type of behavior is prohibited in Leviticus chapter 18. We'll see that in a second. But she answered him and said, "No, my brother, do not violate me. For such a thing is not done in Israel." So what do we see? We went back to what we initially said. What are the components, the two components of sexual assault? One is a lack of consent and the other is force. And we see this in the story of Tamar and her half-brother Amnon, right? And in verse 12, she talks about this thing should not be done in Israel. And that is supported by Leviticus 18 and 9 that says, "Do not have sexual relations with your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether she be born in the same home or elsewhere." Then we go back and transition to 2 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 12. We'll reread that. "But she answered him, 'No, my brother, do not violate me, for such this thing not be done in Israel.'" So she knows he was going to violate her. "For do not do this disgraceful thing. For as for me, where could I get rid of my reproach?" So people who experience sexual trauma experience disgrace. They feel violated. They feel a sense of reproach. "And as for you, you will be like one of the fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." She's basically telling him what to do. "Hey, dude, if you want to be with me, go to the king. I'm pretty sure he'll let me be with you." But he didn't listen to her. However, he would not listen to her. Since he was stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. So we see these concepts of sexual assault, a lack of consent and force. And what happened? Amnon not only committed sexual assault, but he also committed incest. What is incest? Let's look at the article, the Freeman Online. Incest is sexual intercourse between close relatives. And this is an amazing stat that I'm about to read. Roughly 4% of the world's population has engaged in sexual activity with someone in their family at some point in their lives. Just imagine this stat. 4% of the world's population has had some type of sexual interactions or engagement with a member of their family. That's amazing. All right. Now we're going to transition from this story, right, over to the chapter in the Bible that clearly outlines the prohibited sexual behaviors in the Bible. And this is the baseline that has been established for the New Testament. And a lot of what Paul is talking about in his epistles and writings is coming from this chapter, Leviticus chapter 18. And we're going to read verses 6 through 25. And we're going to read from the New International Version because it's easier to understand than the King James Version. And I'll start with verse 6. "No one is to approach any close relatives to have sexual relations. I am the Lord." That's the key here. That's the key here. Number 7, do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. Do not have relations with her. Number 8, do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. That would dishonor your father. And the corresponding scripture to this is 1 Corinthians 5 and 1. He talks about fornication. And 1 Corinthians 7 and 2, right? And the word fornication is a general word that is used to describe different types of sexual sins, all right, to include adultery and incest. Verse 9, do not have sexual relations with your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether she was born in the same home or elsewhere. 10, do not have sexual relations with your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter. That would dishonor you. Verse 11, do not have sexual relations with the daughter of your father's wife, born to your father. She is your sister. 12, do not have sexual relations with your father's sister. She is your father's close relative. Do not have sexual relations with your mother's sister, because she is your mother's close relative. Do not dishonor your father's brother by approaching his wife to have sexual relations with. She is your aunt. 15, do not have sexual relations with your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. Do not have relations with her. 16, do not have sexual relations with your brother's wife. That would dishonor your brother. Do not have sexual relations with both a woman and her daughter. Do not have sexual relations with either her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter. They are her close relatives. That is wickedness. 18, do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living. Do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period. Now, this goes back to 1 Corinthians, I believe, 7 and 5, when we talked about not the husband and wife not defrauding each other, except for a time of fasting. This would be another reason why a man and wife wouldn't have sexual intercourse, is when his wife, was on her administration. Verse 20, do not have sexual relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Number 21, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of God. I am the Lord. Now, I got up on the screen a couple of the pictures of Moloch, which was an idol, right, that was also worshipped by the Canaanites, but the Israelites started doing this as well. And then on the bottom, you'll see the female. So so basically you have two. You have Moloch as the male fertility god, and then there's the female fertility god. Her name is spelled Ashtoreth, Ashtoreth, right? So these two idols were worshipped not only by the Canaanites, but they were beginning to be worshipped by the Israelites as well. And this was prohibited. These were the fertility gods of the male and female, right? Number 22, do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. We're talking about homosexuality, and this could also include lesbianism. 23, do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. That is a perversion. Number 24, do not defile yourself in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled, right? And verse 25, even the land was defiled, so I punished it for the sins, and the land vomited out the inhabitants, right? So when we talk about defilement, right, and we look at it from the Hebrew word, I'm going to put it up on the screen. We're talking about to become unclean, right? So we're going to see that in the Hebrew, to become unclean. So that's what he means by the land becoming defiled. The land becomes unclean. Now, that's the point in point 4. When we commit these types, right, specifically identified in Leviticus 18, these types of forbidden sins, then we not only defile our own bodies, but we defile the land. And we see the Hebrew word for land, defile means to make unclean. Now, there will be 4 or 5 main reasons or main sins that would defile the land. And one of them is incest, Leviticus 18 and 9. It means sexual intercourse between close related persons. Adultery, Leviticus 18 and 20, voluntary sexual intercourse between a married person and somebody who is not lawfully their spouse. Idol worship would be Leviticus 18 and 21, and it means an image or other materials, objects representing a deity to which worship is addressed. Homosexuality and lesbianism, Leviticus 18 and 22. That is basically sexual desires for those who of the same sex and gender. And the same thing with lesbianism, female sexual desire for someone who is of the same sex and gender. And finally, bestiality, Leviticus 18 and 23. And that is sexual intercourse between a person and an animal, right? So how do we define So basically what we've done, as we're going to wrap things up, and then we're going to summarize shortly, is Romans 15:4 talks about whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comforts of the scriptures might have hope. So the Old Testament, particularly Leviticus 18, is for our learning. We're supposed to use this as the basis for how we move forward in terms of understanding what types of sexual behaviors are not and are appropriate. So it's just a baseline, and it's just a model for us to learn from and to use as we set principles and practices in our life. So the fifth point, and probably the final point, is godly sex is consensual sex that is between a man and a woman, husband and wife, who are not relative or kinfolks. And this sex should be done in covenant and or matrimony. And this is done, we see this point in Genesis 24:67, that Isaac brought into his mother's Sarah's tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife. All right. Ruth 4:13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And he went unto her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bare him a son. So we see that is the term for godly sex. So what I want to do here is go back before I do a summary. I want to just talk to the people who have experienced sexual assault. Those who have been molested, those who are suffering in silence, who are currently going through this. I want to tell you that God understands what you've been through. God cares about how you feel. God cares about how this experience has impacted your life. And sometimes you don't even understand how this thing, comes out, how it manifests itself. And I want to tell you that God can heal you of sexual trauma. God can heal you of misusing your body in sexual ways, that God has a plan for this experience, that God can take this bad experience or this thing that has happened to you, and he can allow you to use that as a testimony for what you can do for other people. And you can begin to share what has happened to you and be an inspiration for other people. I definitely have done that. I have not allowed my experience to stop me from being a productive person. It hasn't stopped me from wanting to be successful. It hasn't stopped me from wanting to be a believer in Christ. So for those who have experienced sexual trauma or who are going through this, I want you to get help. If you need to get help, get counseling if you need to get counseling. But I want you to know that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that he can, when you come into Christ, all things have become new, and God can heal you of this trauma. Okay, now we're going to go back and do a quick summary of what we covered today in the 3 minutes that we have remaining. So today we're talking about part 2 of sexual healing and biblical sex education. We said that the 2 main objectives was to define what the Old Testament says about sexual sin, and then I was going to give my testimony. We talked about my inspiration for the study, which was a sister and her book, and how transparent she was, and so I wanted to contribute to the conversation. And we also talked about, once we go over this information, we don't really have any excuses. We have to live by what we know. And James 4:17 says, therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth this not, to him it is sin. We said the first point was that the forbidden sexual behaviors that are outlined traditionally in Leviticus 18 are represented as the word fornication in the New Testament. So first thing we talked about was sexual assault. We went to Deuteronomy 22:25. And we talked about this young woman who was in the field, who was overpowered and sexually assaulted, right? And then we gave you the definition of sexual assault. We said that it means illegal sexual conduct that usually involves force upon a person without consent, right? And so those are the 2 elements of sexual assault. Those are a lack of consent and force. And then we brought this thing to home. We talked about how African-American women experience higher levels of sexual assault than most other ethnic groups. We said that for every black woman who reports rape, at least 15 doesn't. And so we watched a video that talked about this no snitch culture, where we're basically protecting predators, right? Because they're black, black men or black women, right? So we said that this no snitch culture, there was an article that we read that talks about no snitch culture, the black community's universal code. And so we don't want to tell on people who commit crimes, specifically sexual assault. And we said that snitches get stitches, right? We also wanted to make the point that the black church or the church in general or black community does not want to embrace the truth about the rate of sexual assaults, the rate of sexual abuse in our community, and the fact that black men have also experienced sexual trauma. And I said that we cannot handle the truth. And we went over the stats that show this, that 1 in 6 men have admitted to having childhood sexual abuse. 1 in 5 black girls will be sexually abused by the age of 18. 1 in 5 black women are survivors of rape. 35% of black women experience some form of contact sexual violence during their lifetime. 40 to 60% of black women report being subjected to coercive sexual contact by age 18. 17% of black women experience sexual violence other than rape by an intimate partner. And then we talked about how men in our community need to stand up and condemn this behavior and stop taking part in this behavior, right? And we said that if you were experiencing sexual assault or trauma, that you need to contact the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE, 1-800-656-HOPE. And we said that women are generally coming out and having the courage to talk about some of these things. And it doesn't mean that they are dramatizing their trauma, but Revelation 12 and 11 says that we overcome by the word of our testimony. And we said that women are wondering why, some men are not intimate and can't talk about their feelings or can't be faithful or can't be exclusive. And we said that for some of these men, they've experienced sexual trauma. And we said that, as a result of that, we try to hide these things because we're men. We try to be macho and we don't want people to know what's going on with us. And so the victim, right, becomes the victimizer. And we said that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men have experienced sexual trauma as a child. And then we said that the sexual trauma stats show that black experience the same rates as whites, even though blacks are 12.7% of the population and whites are about 61.6%. And then we transitioned and said that there are men who experience sexual trauma while they're incarcerated. There was an article, Exposure to Prison Sexual Assaults Among Incarcerated Men, where they had basically did a survey of 134 men and found that 43% of them said that they heard of a man being sexually assaulted, and 16% of them said they actually saw it. Then we transitioned over and talked about sexual assault as under slavery. It's called buck breaking, B-U-C-K. And we read an article, Buck Breaking, the use of sexual violence against enslaved men as punishment for wrongdoing, right? So basically these men were sexually assaulted because they were defiant. You had a group of white men going from plantation to plantations, gang raping these men, right? And then we talked about my testimony when I was 4, 5, I was sexually assaulted or molested by an older male relative. He's passed away. I didn't experience any of that. I'm not gay. I'm not bisexual. I haven't experienced any type of sexual trauma as an adolescent or not adolescent, but as a teen or an adult. And I wouldn't play that, if you know what I mean. So, those are things that I experienced. And so I will be one of the 6 that were surveyed that have experienced that. And then we talked about childhood sexual trauma, the residuals of that, and adult sexual traumas and the residuals of that, all the mental disorders that are associated with the behavior disorders, the eating disorders, the suicide attempts, and all the different types of things that you experience as a result of sexual trauma. Then we transition over to 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 10 to 14. And we talked about the story of Tamar and her half-brother Amnon, and how Amnon basically wanted to sleep with his sister. He plotted and he raped her, sexually assaulted her, right? And we transitioned and talked to you about what was incest. It basically means sexual relations between close relatives. And we said that roughly 4% of the world's population has engaged in some type of sexual activity with a relative, which is amazing stat. Then we wanted to cover all of the prohibited sexual behaviors in some of them, not all, but most of those which were in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 6 to 25. We're not going to read them again, but we read from the New International Version, right? Just because it was easier to read. We talked about the fertility gods for the male and female, which was Molech and Ashtoreth. Right. And these were gods that the Canaanites brought to the Israelites, and they start practicing them as well. And then we talked about defilement. Right. And we said that the point was that when we commit these types of forbidden sexual sins, we defile ourselves and we defile the land. And we said in Hebrew that word defile means to make unclean. And then finally, we talked a little bit about the types of sins that defile the land. Incest, Leviticus 18 and 19, 18 and 9, excuse me, which means sexual intercourse between close relatives, right? Adultery, voluntary sexual intercourse between a married person and someone who is other than their lawful spouse. Idol worship, which is an image of other materials, which is in Leviticus 18 and 21. Homosexuality, Leviticus 18 and 22. And that simply means, male having sexual desires or sexual relations with the people of the same sex or gender. And lesbianism is females desiring sexual behavior, sexual desires or behavior towards women, people of the same sex and gender, right? And then we talked about bestiality, which was Leviticus 18 and 23. And that means sexual relations between a person and an animal. And then we finished up with understanding that Romans 15 and 4 talks about the Old Testament was for our learning. And we define godly sex, as we wrap it up, as consensual sex that is between a man and a woman, a husband and wife, who are not relatives or kinfolks. This sex should be done in covenant and or matrimony. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for watching. God bless.